There's another one coming along in September on investigative journalism, which some of the people here are going to contribute to, which is called Investigative Journalism Dead or Alive, based on a conference in Coventry 2 or 3 weeks ago. Richard and I are working on that, which will be out mid-September. The other Richard, approximately, do you think? With a foreword by Sir Harry Evans, no less. And then another one later in the year called Mirage in the Desert, about the reporting of the Middle Eastern revolts or revolutions, call them what you will, which will have a foreword by John Snow. He doesn't realise he's writing it yet, but it will. So keep buying them, keep coming. Thank you, as we've got to say, thank you to the two Richards, to Richard Franklin from Abramus, who's published it at the back, and Richard Keeble, who spent many happy hours sub-editing you all and turning you into sense or not. BBC College of Journalism, Kevin, who's here, and David Hayward, who's over there, who put on the conference and done lots of other things. The Coventry's Vice-Chancellor, Madeleine Atkins, who's not here, but who is a wonderful support in all of these things. The Coventry Money Men, who are David Pillsbury and Martin Woolley, who provide the money for the conferences and a bit for the books. But most of all, thank you to the authors. Quite a lot of you are here. You do it for nothing. All you get is a glass of wine and a copy of the book, plus a chance to buy one at discount. You give up an awful lot of your time. You're persuaded by Richard and I to do these things. God knows why, but you do them and you produce some simply wonderful stuff. If you haven't bought the book, if you're not here as an author, please do. There are some startling contributions in it. So buy their work, please. It's £15 at the back. And just as you settle down, you haven't come here to listen to me. One of the authors, Ray, one of the two Snoddies in the book is Ray.
Hello and welcome. You do realise that tonight is the Journalism Press Awards, and I congratulate you for coming here instead of there, but the downside must be that no one in this room has been judged worthy of an award. However, your reward will be much greater because you will hear or be exposed to the views, the collections in this book, as many as 25 different people. And as John said, it's a remarkable new model of publishing. He's already referred to the financial looker we get for writing for this thing, absolutely nothing, the glass of wine. But the method is this. So all of you who have not done a chapter, beware. It goes like this. It starts off with a little email. We're doing this book. Would you like to write a chapter? Be about 2,500, maybe up to 3,500 words. Oh, and yeah, I'd like it by the end of the month. All right. Because John Mayer's emails are very terse and to the point. So if you don't want to write a chapter of a book for nothing, run a mile the next time John Mayer comes calling. I love his introduction to parts of this great book, and this could almost start us off. John Mayer, the status quo is on shifting sands. Sticking to print or linear broadcasting is not an alternative in 2011. Like it or not, you have to face the future as a publisher, journalist, journalism, educator, or student. Slightly more terse is the co-editor, Richard Keeble of Lincoln, Section 10. What does it all mean? And I hope before this evening is out that you will be enlightened in all of that. To my right is Kevin Marsh, until 4 days ago, executive editor of the BBC College of Journalism. I'm so glad he's here today rather than 5 days ago, because now, for the first time in many decades, Kevin Marsh can be an honest man. And I hope you will benefit from his new freedom, having kicked the sometimes extremely bad habit of working for the BBC. To my left is Laura Oliver, community coordinator for the Guardian News and Media and former editor of journalism.co.uk. I think that grand title translates into slavery in the world of blogging, non-stop for modest wages, because the Guardian pays modest wages. And we also have the far side, Judith Townend, freelance journalist, events coordinator, former journalism.co.uk editor, but also a contributor to our great volume, Battle of wits or twits, with little brackets, question mark, using Twitter as a journalistic tool. But let's kick this off with the views of Kevin Marsh, who will be using his new freedom to write about Hutton, the BBC, and the future of the world. But in January 2010, he put this to a conference of journalism students in London. Skills and tools are a means to an end. And no matter how exciting multimedia and social media are, the way in which new, easier ways of doing things come on stream, they're not an end in themselves. Don't become a Twitter head. Like the petrol head who knows everything about cars, but forgets the point of them is to go from one place to another. Make sure you stay outside the bubble. And yes, I'm in this goddamn book too, the sort of saga tendency in which the headline put over it was, old dogs can learn new tricks. Judge for yourself, but first, Kevin Marsh and his thoughts on where we reached on the digital revolution as far as journalism is concerned, and is there any possible escape from any of it?
Yes, but I think one of the things that is terribly important for us all today, and page 302 of this excellent book is the chapter you need to read. The thing that is a real problem, I think, for journalists at the moment is we see this massively expanding information universe. We see quicker, better, more subtle, more global ways of getting information from one person to another. We find better, more subtle, more personalized ways of getting the information that matters to us as individuals. And we get a bit overexcited about all of this because it is fantastically new. It's intensifying trends, I guess, in human communication that have always been there. And we get very, very excited, and we think it's journalism, and it's not. And I think, if anything, my chapter in this book and what my work post-BBC I think is going to be about is trying to remind us all that journalism is a very, very small, precise, important, socially vital, culturally vital part of the information universe. It is not coterminous with the information universe. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. In the old days, we journalists, we had it all. We had a monopoly. We could bundle up information with news. We could bundle up information with investigation. We could bundle up information with eyewitness reporting. And people bought it in their newspapers, in their TV channels, in their radio programs, and so on and so forth. The weather was there. The news was there. The football results were there. The investigation was there. In other words, the whole bundle was a thing that was marketable. It enabled journalism to survive. Journalism as a very specialized activity. Of course, what happened when the web came along was slowly at first, but increasingly over the last 5 years, certainly since 2004, 2005, the ways of getting information have simply gone bang. You can get any information that you want from anywhere, precisely the information that you need. And the problem for journalists has been twofold. Threefold. One, many journalists have been stuck in an old business model which is no longer sustainable. Two, many people in the audience have not necessarily understood that journalism is something very particular, very precise, very special, which needs preserving. And three, we journalists have lost sight of that as well, and we've tended to think that journalism is about getting information from A to B. It ain't. It's part of that, but it's not that. And here's the problem. That journalism is about some very specific skills, some of which, incidentally, we have as journalists undermined ourselves, like finding the truth and telling it truthfully, like honest reporting, like honest eyewitness reporting, and so on and so forth, independent investigation. We've kind of sold the pass on some of this stuff by dressing things up that aren't actually journalism as journalism. But we've also, as journalists, become very excited at these ways of getting information across and finding new markets in selling information. And we have therefore forgotten that journalism is a very specific and precise trade, and it still requires the very specific and precise skills and tools that it always did. the mindset that's curious, the mindset that wants to know, the mindset that won't take no for an answer, the persistence, the ability to put two things together and see the pattern in them, the ability to see something and report it faithfully, the ability to understand what is going on in the world and report it honestly, the ability to look at those things which have salience in the world. In other words, the things that rise to the top of the public discourse, not just the whole of the public discourse, but also the ability to have a moral salience, to understand those things that are just wrong. Where did the thalidomide investigation come from? Because somebody realised something was just plain wrong. The investigation of the Insight team that found the third man, Philby, because it was wrong that the establishment had covered it up. So all of these skills, if we're not very careful, and this is what my chapter in the book is about, if we don't see through the current tools, through to the skills, we will lose these skills. And that's what worries me. And I hope that in the discussion this evening, we'll be able to identify one thread that is separate from the other threads. And that is the thing that is very precious, that is called journalism, that I think we need to preserve, and we need to shout its preservation. Because if we don't, believe me, it will become buried under the information revolution.
The information revolution is indeed an absolute deluge, but you're not, I presume, arguing for a second that the narrow thing that you call journalism cannot exist just as well out there in the blogosphere as in the citadels of traditional journalism.
Of course it can, but the problem is that if you read some of the critics and gurus who have been writing since the mid-2000s, people like Jay Rosen, Jeff Jarvis, Joe Trippi and so on and so forth, the phrase, the overthrow of everything, is not far from their lips. And in fact, Joe Trippi entitled his book exactly that. The revolution will not be televised. The overthrow of everything. And this idea that somehow journalism has fundamentally changed because of the way our ability to access information has gone poof. It actually hasn't. All that's changed is our ability to access information. What is required within that context, you're quite right, Ray, is the application of those journalistic skills to this information explosion.
Laura, from your different perspective across a different generation to either him or me, do you believe that everything of a traditional nature is going to be overthrown, or do you recognise Kevin's distinction between the narrow thing called journalism and sheer deluges of information?
Well, there's a lot in what Kevin says that I very much agree with, and I think I also, by the way, I didn't contribute to the book, so I don't have a chapter to fall back on, so this is all...
But 302 is a good one. Which
302 is excellent. But what I should say, some of the things that I have picked up from the book very much ring true with what Kevin is saying. So we may see, and I'm going to borrow words from Paul Bradshaw, who I don't know if he's here, in a recent... in the recent lecture at City University, Paul was talking about the fact that we conflate the tools with journalism. So people who endlessly in blog posts say, is Twitter journalism? Is blogging going to kill the newspaper? You know, you're looking at it from the wrong perspective. These are tools, these are ways of communicating. And as part of that, there's an excellent essay in the book by Dan Bennett, who is here, who talks about the impact that these new communication tools have had further afield, and we've seen recently in Egypt and Tunisia. But the fact that the media and many bloggers wish to call it a Twitter revolution or a Facebook revolution, and this is Dan's words from his book, might actually be the fact that we as journalists are coming to grapple with those tools and perhaps putting a little bit more weight on them than they actually had in those events. They were part of the change, but to label it as such is overblowing it. In terms of dealing with information, shall I tell you where I come from? First of all, I've only been at The Guardian for 3 months, so I can't speak for the whole operation, but my job there is to deal with GASP, the readers. I deal with the readers. I provide a bridge from the readers of our site around our news content and our site as well, and what they think about what we're doing. And I have the dubious pleasure of feeding that back to editorial and hopefully making changes for the better.
Do you ever see anything that really interests you that you think your editors and betters would benefit from?
All the time. All the time.
Examples,
so,
please?
for example, I have been living in our live blogs recently. The Guardian is developing its live coverage of events quite ferociously, actually. And I have spent a lot of time covering Egypt and the recent uprisings in Libya, so from the beginning of this year. And frankly, the information we're getting, the good quality information we're getting is first-person accounts. Other sources that we do not have time to aggregate. And I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, how do you know they're first person? How do we verify them?
The thought was just crossing my mind as you spoke.
And this is all part of the process. But what I wanted to say in terms of dealing with the information is, for me, I completely agree with Kevin that the traditional values of journalism still apply. Your sourcing, how you verify things, how you fact check things still apply in this age where we have more information coming in. But there is a kind of greying area in between of, for example, what I would describe as above the line on our website, below the line, and then what we do in between. So the information we're being provided with, how do we handle that? We can verify it up to a certain extent. How do we then take it from there? Do we run with it and frame it as such and say we know this much about it? And I think we do. I think we have to be transparent in what we're doing because we have the opportunity for our readers and our users and our viewers to fill in the gaps. And I'm not saying that means we throw caution to the wind. I'm not saying we single source everything. But on certain occasions, there's chances for us to make better use of this information we're getting and to filter it. And I think those are the new skills that journalists are coming across. I'm not saying that they replace the traditional skills. In fact, I think they're very much a complement to them.
Okay. And this is a slightly difficult question, given that you work for The Guardian and Alan Rushbridger is editor-in-chief of The Guardian and Observer, another contributor to the book. If you want to find out where brackets most things happen first, go to Twitter. I presume you'd agree with your great leader on that one.
It depends what it is, what a contrary answer. For the recent examples I gave, yes, because amongst those uprisings, Twitter was one of the fastest ways to disseminate information. And before we could get it out and get it checked and get it subbed, someone else was going to be doing it. I'm not saying you would then republish all of those tweets, but you have to be aware that all your readers are reading those too. They're going to be aware of these. You need to treat them intelligently. They're going to be aware of this information coming through. So it's up to us to recommend it, link to it, discount it perhaps as well, and guide them through it. But in terms of turning to it first, yes, very much so.
What about Kevin's basic point that there may be wonderful gems within this, but the absolute deluge of information? How do you decide between one thing and another, what's important and what's not? How can any one human being cope?
Well, that is my job. I think you, as with any kind of new tool, content management system, audio recorder, you become adept at it quite quickly. You learn with your more traditional skills of weighing things up, how they sound, instinct, is anyone else saying this? Trusted sources, trusted networks. When you spend a long time within these so-called new networks, you get to know who the influencers are. You get to know who you can trust, just as you would with your contacts book. It's exactly the same.
So new hierarchies are emerging, and all Twitterers are not equal.
Yes, as with any kind of online content, you have to treat them as you would any other source and see where the provenance is from that. But the great thing about this deluge of information is I can use it to build up a picture of a particular community on Twitter or a particular forum because it's there for me to access. I can see the history of those users, I can see what else they post, and I can use my journalistic nous to build up an idea of who those contacts are. I'm lucky to have that information.
Judith, in your excellent chapter in the book, your final paragraph scared the bejesus out of me. Thanks to my digital son, and the details of how I came to love LinkedIn and Twitter is in the book. But I thought, hey, I've made it. That's it. I now know and understand these things. And you told me that there's something called Quora emerging, which is a blend of Twitter and Wikipedia. Before you give us your main thoughts, just do we have to face new goddamn things coming around every 6 months?
Well, I hope so. Otherwise, it would be really boring if we stopped here. I mean, I think Twitter has been kind of revolutionary in journalism, and certainly it kind of completely changed the way I thought about journalism. And I'm not saying it is the future of journalism, and I hope my chapter deals with that, because I mean, especially my job at journalism.co.uk, I covered a lot of future of journalism conferences, and it sort of made me quite sceptical about the whole concept.
Did you find the answer?
I never found the answer, sadly. I kept hoping. But,
What does it all mean, as Mr. Keeble says?
So I mean, so I took kind of maybe an easy line in that chapter and saying, you know, it's part of the answer, but not the whole answer. But you have to be prepared for something else on the horizon and adapt to it, I think. And when I wrote that chapter, Quora everyone was talking about that. I was looking at that a lot, and I have to say I haven't actually been looking at it very much since then. So it was just an example of one tool that was new on the scene.
Just a question to complete that thought before we move on to your general take on all these things. There are some people who argue that from recent history, one method of social media will instantly supplant another, and there's quite a few examples, as Mr. Murdoch found out to his cost. But with Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, perhaps, have they reached over a certain threshold where they will have established permanence, or will they too go the way of old digital flesh? And it's only a matter of time.
In terms of
Survival, longevity.
Or their role in journalism, or just
indeed so.
I mean, journalists will certainly probably find better ways of finding information and where you mine that and go to the places that people are having conversations. I mean, Facebook is so huge and such a big part of people's social lives and maybe a bit of their work lives, but mainly their social lives, that it's hard to see that disappearing very quickly. But then, you know, MySpace was huge. And like you say, you know, Rupert Murdoch took a call on that. And
most people were distraught to find out that he'd lost £500 million or so.
And there's so many limitations. I mean, Twitter, there are so many limitations of it as a medium, and it's very frustrating at times. I mean, it's not actually a very efficient way of having a conversation. But it was in a gap where there was no sort of provided a means of having conversations that you couldn't before. So that's really useful, and I think it's been very compelling and useful for journalists. I don't know enough about the sort of future of social media in terms of whether...
Don't worry, I will stop taking you off. What you really want to talk about is how you see this world of digital journalism in future, and what some of the perhaps ladies and gentlemen of a certain age ought to learn to survive a little bit longer.
Well, I thought I won't talk for very long, because we should probably do it proportionate to our length of careers.
No, believe me, you have a lot to teach all of us, I suspect.
Amazed at how long Kevin had been at the BBC.
I was amazed at how long I'd been at the BBC.
But I suppose I sit here not really representing an organisation, and actually my kind of primary thing I'm doing at the moment is a PhD. So I've got a kind of portfolio career, which wasn't very easy to fill in on the census form, really annoyingly. But just these digital tools, and like I said, the sort of way you have conversations, and going to journalism.co.uk, which had already set up a big Twitter account, it was already talking to its readers, which were mainly journalists through that, just gave me a different way of doing journalism, because before that I'd always seen social media as a place that you went to get information and then put that into your story. But I sort of, the idea of using my own identity on it was just, it hadn't even occurred to me particularly before that. So I'm amazed that I even got the job at that point, really, because I wasn't very savvy on that. And now it's just sort of a part of my everyday life. Oh God, this sounds a bit cheesy, but it's a part of my everyday sort of tool set in terms of researching different topics. And I don't even know how you would do that without going to kind of public sites like Twitter. And I mean, I was interested in what you asked Laura about in terms of what you learn from the readers, and whether Twitter is always the go-to place. And Twitter is such a small proportion of UK society. I mean, the danger is for journalists not to read too much into it, I think, because, I mean, if you just think about your group of friends and family, how many of them are actually using Twitter? I mean, most people using Twitter I know are journalists. So I don't see that as a kind of representative picture of society at all, and I think journalists have to be very wary of that.
Yeah, I'm minded of the BBC example, a change in education. BBC went straight down the road to Shepherd's Bush and interviewed 6 black children, one after another, in a school in Shepherd's Bush, because that's who those children were. It was just sheer laziness, and it sounds like we're in danger of getting that sort of specialised sample, shall we say?
I mean, my worst thing that I see on Twitter is this journo request. They have a tag, and ask, they're looking for a case study, and I just think that's so lazy, and so it just exposes the whole, the bad side of journalism, I think, in terms of setting up. You've got your story in your mind, you're looking for the case study to slot into that story, and so I suppose it's...
Well, surely isn't that just regularising something that happened, that you asked your friends for a case study?
Well, yeah, but I don't think that should happen, particularly. I think that's a really annoying side of British journalism, that we've got into that culture of sort of I'm quite interested in the process of journalism and how stories get constructed, but in the idea that you've got these characters that have to be in a story and then you have to go out looking for them afterwards, I think that's sometimes maybe a bit upside down.
What about Kevin's point that journalism is a small, specific thing, and we're in some problems if we don't recognise that, the difference between journalism and information?
I'm really interested in that, because I'm not quite sure what the exact the pure form of journalism is, because what I've found quite compelling is blog posts that I've read by Mark Reeves, who set up the Business Desk West Midlands, and Adam Timworth at RBI, who talked about the journalism package and why people were buying newspapers, and it was for a lot of things all around journalism, and not just that, maybe what we kind of hold up high as the investigative journalism and all of that kind of that pure form. So I think there's a value in all of that too, in TV listings and in job advertising and all of that kind of thing.
But that's what kind of deceives us, that this was always part of the same thing. And actually, when you looked at, or you currently look at the paper, the information is very clearly separate from the journalism. I think the risk is, well, it's not a risk, it's happening, that in this kind of new universe, information universe, some information that shouldn't be gets legitimised because of the medium through which it comes. And I think this is the problem, part of the problem with Twitter, for
any
instance.
examples of that before you move on?
I'd have to think to come up with...
Are you thinking of things like the tweets during the Mumbai bombings, for example?
There were tweets during the... But it's also absences and presences. A plane ditches in the Hudson, it's tweeted out of existence. A plane crashes in the African countryside, may as well not happen. And that's the disparity that I think we have with some of these new, with some of the new tools that we talk about. And because we kind of think they're a bit like journalism, we invest them with a legitimacy they don't actually have. They don't claim to have. But the more we as journalists say, this is a new way of journalism, the more we invest what is simply gossip with the volume turned up and call that journalism. And it's not about purity. You're making me sound sort of more Catholic than I really should sound.
More Jesuit, surely, not just really Catholic.
But it is... Something has got... I will believe this to my dying day. Something has got to put the stamp on something, saying, look, bang, this has been through a kind of process. You can trust it, tells the truth, we've been to the right place, we've got the right access. Now, I know you're going to say, a lot of journalism at the moment doesn't do that, and this is where we're in such a weak position as journalists, that we've sold a pass, we've screwed our own future by, well, those of us who have, making up stories, pretending things are investigations when in fact we're trapping people doing the very thing we're trying to make them do in the first place. And all of this has kind of undermined journalism to an extent that it makes it very hard for us to argue that in all of this information universe, there's some stuff that's got, bang, a big J stamped on it. But I firmly believe we've got to get back to that. Otherwise, we lose this question, which is really important to the public domain, of the discussion around the salient points. We don't need to discuss everything in the world, but we do need to discuss those things which are salient at a particular time. And that's the other thing that journalism brings us.
Raj Bridger said that what we need to have is independently verifiable information, and there's a difficulty potentially about funding that in future.
But that sounds a bit like sort of offing or something, when in fact it's the job that journalism should be doing.
How have you, now you're even more into your thinking mode, having left the BBC School of Journalism?
I never used to think or tell the truth.
I said even more into your thinking mode. Now you have more time to sit and think. Have you got the answer to your own problem? A way of providing that stamp of authority, whether it comes from digital, the internet, or from what some of us would still call traditional journalism? What is the answer to the problem in
Well, I mean, there are some areas of traditional journalism which have that stamp implicitly running through it. You kind of believe what you read in the FT. You kind of believe, what you see on the BBC, ITV, Sky. You sort of believe some of the sources, other sources you discount. So implicitly there is that kind of J mark running through some of what we do. But I think it's a question of distilling those elements. Why do we trust some newspapers? Why are some newspapers not even trusted by 92% of the people who buy them? Only 8% of people who buy The Sun trust a word they say in it. Now, there's something a bit Wookiee going on there. But why is it that some newspapers are trusted in the high 70s, other newspapers are trusted in the single figures? Now you can point at regulation, you can point at higher editorial standards, you can point at people adhering to codes and so on. Even the NUJ code is better than the codes that most newspapers have. So you can find ways of defining what it is that makes us trust one set of information over another. But there are two, I don't want to sort of there are two other things that I think are very important here. It's not just a question of trust. It is a question of salience. The public domain or the public sphere doesn't work because it's discussing everything all the time. Certain things pop up to the surface, and it's a function of journalism, actually, to push those things up to the surface. And the other thing that journalism brings, which most of the new technologies just don't bring, it's that power to convene around single areas of debate. So today, for instance, there would have been 4.5 million people listening to, was it Dave Willits? I can't remember who it was now, talking about social mobility or whatever. Now, you do not... Sorry? No, that was at lunchtime. It was Dave Willits. But, you have 4.5 million people around that set of ideas. Now, you can say, well, whose right is it to call the agenda, whatever. But you do get a public discussion around a particularly powerful, salient idea, which you just do not get in the more diffuse environment of the new technologies.
Do you agree with that? I mean, surely the digital environment can bring together even larger international groupings almost instantly.
Can I also pick up on a couple of things? I agree about rebuilding trust, and not to sound too evangelical, I do want us to make journalism better, and I do want our readers to trust us more and therefore to be brought more into the process. But I'm really concerned in sort of reclaiming our J stamp, which I very much like as an idea, as a motif, that we don't build a wall up around it again and say this is the information we have and this is what you're allowed to know. Perhaps the thing is with trust is that we are no longer necessarily always the ones that have access to the information. Certain times, and there are some fantastic investigative journalists who will eke out sources of information that you nor I would ever have access to, but by and large, this wave of information, which Kevin is correct in describing, is now open to our audiences as well as us. And although it's up to us to filter it, analyse it, and raise things to the top, our readers can do that as well and may come up with completely different stories from what we come up to. And I've totally forgotten the other question that you asked. Sorry.
Sorry, so it's Ray.
Would you have a J stamp, or would like to see a J stamp?
I don't know whether it's relevant particularly. I mean, I suppose if you think about it in terms of media organisations and the way that they're funded, yes. But I mean, in terms of trust, if you did a survey across, say, news sources online, there'd be certain readers of certain blogs would probably have 90% or 100% trust for certain, but maybe, I mean, obviously, what you immediately get thrown back when you say something like that is, well, how do they earn their money? And it's not but they're writing things and they're trusted and they earn their money in some completely different way normally. And so I don't know whether it's useful always to compare, say, the tabloids with maybe a different kind of news source, and maybe we have to think about things a bit differently. And I'm just very suspicious of sort of kite marking systems and things like that. I mean, whether you're talking about something actually existing or not, but no, but
it's figurative.
But even
runs through some of the journalism that already exists.
I mean, some of the most sort of reputable bloggers that do what many of us would define as journalism would, run a mile if they thought they were going to be defined as journalists.
I mean, what would you define as a journalist these days? What is a journalist?
What a question.
Yeah.
As opposed to what you do.
Well, I think it's really interesting because I don't think there are. I mean. When you compare what someone's doing in a journalism school with what some people are just doing outside off their own back, they could be doing exactly the same sort of thing, but don't necessarily call themselves a journalist. I think it's all got really muddled because I think you can do journalism and not earn money for it. and that gets...
Yeah, there's an awful lot of freelancers who would agree with you that. But Kevin, do you agree that it really is muddled what a journalist is and isn't?
I don't think it's
these
that
days?
muddled. I mean, the former LA Times editor, John Carroll, he once said it's the constitutional right of every citizen, no matter how depraved, to be a journalist. And I think that sort of, in a sense, is the problem with the trade of journalism, that it is kind of institutionalized free speech, and therefore you can't sort of lock it off. Places like China lock off journalism. You've got to, be on the register, and I think Zimbabwe did for a while. So Russia still does to some extent. I think what you can do, you can see the characteristics of a journalist, and whether they're paid or not. I mean, there are some journalists who are paid, in inverted commas, but they're not really paid because they're not paid enough to actually put food on the table in many cases. But I think you can look at some of the characteristics, that are very clear about what a journalist, one way or another, has access to people who have information, can understand the information that they gather, can process it, can report it truthfully, can get to places, has the application, has the persistence. So you can understand the characteristics. Now, of what, in a sense, they don't necessarily define a journalist, but they shade in the area of our lives that journalists occupy. Whether they're paid for it, I don't think is either here or there. But I do think there is this, this double question, which you may argue is part of the old traditional landscape. A journalist's job is, to some extent, to define those salient arguments that we as a society need to have. And it's to convene the public around those arguments in relatively large numbers. And I think those are the two stumbling blocks that most kind of para-journalists end up coming up against. Because, however good someone like Ben Goldacre is, and he's brilliant, and I trust him hugely, and he's fantastic, there's still a hell of a lot fewer people read his blog than read the crap in the Daily Mail that he is no doubt writing about.
Did you bristle? I think I saw you bristling
I don't know if I've ever bristled.
At the coining of a new terminology, para-journalist.
Para-journalists. I don't think the people we're thinking of as para-journalists would like that phrase at all. That's an interesting point, particularly about people like Ben Goldacre, and it brings to mind people who I think are doing some of the jobs that people that we're happy to call journalists should be doing. And Judith's equally well versed in this, but people who are involved in the open data movement, who are scouring through local government records to expose what's going on there, or who even are better documenting what's going on locally. And yes, they may be few and far between, but they're doing jobs that journalists should be doing. I can't comment on the Daily Mail's audience size. I don't have the scientific equation behind that. But I think your other point as well, this is what I was going to pick up on, this is probably what I bristled about whether you can have those meeting places and discussions online about the most salient points and about the debates the public should be having. Of course you can. I read through them every single day, and they might not be the debates we expect to happen. I think journalists are very much as Jude was describing with the process of the story, we then have a process in our heads already of how the discussion following on that story should go amongst our readers. And actually, most of the time, our readers will throw it back in our face and say, this is the part of that policy or that bill that we are most interested in. Go away and find us out more about it.
Judith, did you like the term para-journalism?
It's a new one to me.
I think you just invented it. You clearly just made it up there at this moment.
The flip side, I suppose, of saying, journalists are able to deal with all this information is they're also constrained by their own system, I suppose, in terms of having to produce a certain number of stories a day, and going back to what I was saying earlier about kind of contriving stories around looking for case studies and things. So it can be very liberating, I think, that people have got a freedom now to kind of, and like Laura says, set the story in a different place and say, actually, we're interested in this bit of the story, and then that can happen somewhere completely outside of a traditional newsroom.
But it's very interesting, isn't it, that on your data point, that if you look at the what's it called? What's your thing? Investigate My MP.
Investigate MP's expenses.
Yeah.
Our award-winning news app.
Yeah. Only half of the documents that were posted have so far been processed, because of course people, like me, like all the rest of us, we have an initial interest in something and then we lose interest in it. And in those 200,000 so far unexamined documents on your own site, there could be the gem, the thing that will really crack this story open. Now, the decision to turn that over to the audience and the public, laudable, generous, and far-thinking though it was, has not actually produced a single story from the second half of the documents that have so far not been looked at. And I think this is part of the problem, that, you know, if it's not the job of journalism to do this, and if instead we try to outsource it to the public, it only happens for as long as the public is interested in it.
Well, that's almost by definition, isn't it?
And
Well, not interested in the story, but interested in going through the work. And that's what I mean about having the access, the application, and the skills.
I agree with,
I think you made a telling point there.
I
Mr.
agree with
Marsh.
some of that. However, I should point out, I think at last check, the second version of that application, more than 40,000 documents, had been worked through by our readers. That's a huge amount. Think how long it would take our journalists to go through that. And I'm not saying that the journalists shouldn't be going through it. And also, that is one of the first iterations, and it was before I was there, of The Guardian trying to crowdsource that kind of work. It is a work in progress. I don't think crowdsourcing has reached maturity. I don't think we're kind of seeing, particularly in the UK, the sort of stories that journalists expect to necessarily get back when we put out a request like that. And it's a learning process. What happens with the information that you don't process is probably the biggest question. And what happens with those experiments after the event has passed? How do you continue to maintain that interest? That's a golden question. One thing you can take from that is to look at where users have been interested, what they've gone for, because that kind of data and that kind of information will really tell us what sections of our politics site or our MPs the readers are truly interested in.
What they're truly interested in. Do you ever get depressed when you look at the most looked at online stories in the Times, and it's nothing to do with politics, or it's the latest bloody tittle tattle scandal and gossip, and if you go down the route of what the public are most interested in, isn't that a bloody dangerous place to go, as opposed to what you think they ought to be interested in?
I think there's a balance to be struck. I'm not in favour of turning over a news website entirely to personalised news. There are services that can do that for you if that's what you want. But I do think we need to. I'm gonna borrow Paul Bradshaw's words again because they're much better than mine. He said journalists really need to get over themselves and they need to start seeing their readers as assets and not costs. And I think that's so true. Not in this job, but in my previous experience as a media hack, talking to journalists who didn't want to hear from their readers. They liked the fact that there wasn't a facility on their website to comment or to. Then who on earth were you writing for in the first place? I'm saying what you do with this information is up to you, but an intelligent news organisation will use it and build on it and will complement your coverage, your, as you were saying, the salient public debating points, alongside the gaps that we've got filled in by readers who are actually telling us, no, this is the really interesting stuff happening over here. I'm fortunate I work for a website where the most read story doesn't tend to be salacious titter-tattle. I did read an excellent, well, not excellent, but saw a lovely regional newspaper site today where the top most read story was crowd gathers on bridge was the headline. I think it had circulated so far on Twitter, everyone had gone and read it, and that was the point of the story. But I'm fortunate not to work somewhere where that tends to happen a lot. And that's why I'm against kind of personalising news agendas to that extent on a news site. But I do think you can better use that data that you get from your readers.
Isn't there danger, Judith, that from my own personal experience, I absolutely love feedback of a positive nature, and hate the people who say, "What sort of a scumbag are you that wrote this?" You know, I mean, how do you deal with the ruder elements of the digital world? And there seems to be, dear God, in my experience, there seems to be quite a lot of rude people out there.
I have to say, because I mean, I reported a lot of stories about journalists that were caught up in these storms, and I have to say, I mean, luckily, I've never really got myself into too much trouble. But I think it was like the columnists that deliberately set themselves up as very provocative, and that it was always them that were at the centre of these things, and it was a style, and you got what you gave kind of thing quite often.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously there are incidents, and there's horrible sides of online technology that you see, and especially not even in the kind of journalism field, but in terms of almost bullying and things. But actually, in terms of commenting on stories, it's quite often it was, if you play nice, then it kind of all works out quite well, quite often.
Okay. Kevin, something Jill said a little while ago, relishing the freedom of the journalism involved when you get out of traditional newsrooms. Is there real freedom out there? And certainly for the traditional journalists, I see newsrooms where reporters don't get out anymore, where they might as well be attached to a computerized treadmill from the Victorian age. They never get out to lunch, dear God. They never get to speak to real people. They just process words and occasionally use the telephone. Is that a long way away from the journalism that you have in mind?
It's a million miles from the journalism I've got in mind, but it's not a million miles away from the kind of journalism that happens in far too many places. And it's partly because the newspapers or the news organisations that those people work for have tended to, again, as I said at the beginning, have tended to misunderstand that distinction between information and journalism. And that you only get the journalism by having the journalists out in the street, talking to people, doing whatever they're doing, and not sitting in the office processing information. You know, I don't agree with everything that Jeff Jarvis says, but one thing he does say, which is, you know, do what you do best and link to the rest, absolutely should be the mantra of every news organisation. Why have we got journalists sitting in an office processing PA, press releases, Reuters, and so on and so forth? Don't need to. Why aren't they out there getting stories that are important to our community, that are salient, that are part of the discussion, but also a part of they're able to construct the narrative, because that's the other thing that is missing from the data flood that we're facing. It is the narrative that we construct around the data. And again, we forget at our peril that journalism is about telling stories. True stories, yeah, eyewitness preferably, involving real people preferably, but it's still about telling stories, because that is the way that you engage people with things that they did not know they wanted to be engaged with. Otherwise, you lose that serendipity. You're never engaging people with those things that are outside their immediate experience, and so on and so forth. So the ability to tell stories is another thing that is very important. In answer to your question, Ray, it is happening in too many newsrooms that people are sitting around and processing. It's absolutely the case in too many BBC newsrooms that we have people processing and reprocessing. You know, and it ain't great. But it's partly because we haven't really understood this difference, that journalists should do journalism and we can do the information bit some other way.
You've been out of work for 4 days.
Out of work is not the way I would describe it.
Out of work for 4 days. Would you consider returning as a national newspaper editor? I think you might have a lot to teach them.
I don't think anyone would ask me.
Before I open up the thing, I just want to just give you some idea of the astonishing diversity in this book. There's something like 28 chapters, nearly all of them by different people. And indeed, Kevin talked earlier about the salience of a plane crashing in Africa, no one paying any attention. I'll have you know that there's a chapter, social networks at the heart of Guyana's sole online news operation, Africa at 50 and the digital future, implications for African journalists, and towards a new balance, the rise of new media in China. So the salience may not be out there, but it's certainly reflected in this book. But look, we've got lots of people who've written chapters, lots of distinguished journalists I recognize in the audience. Please engage. Or I'll jump on you, volunteer you, but luckily there are volunteers. She was first. Say who you are first.
Yes, sure. My name is Bari Alamuddin. I'm a journalist with Al Hayat newspaper. And I'm very interested in what you said, as I have witnessed a lot of lazy journalism lately as I was covering events in Bahrain and in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Tunisia, etc. And I have actually noticed that a lot of my friends, many of my friends, and I've always, coming from the Lebanon, have looked up on journalism abroad, specifically the BBC and journalists that write for the Times or the Sunday Times, etc.
Could I stop you there and ask you, what examples of lazy journalism did you recently see?
I was just going to come to that, yeah. So what I have noticed is while I was going all around the area in different places, just seeing a full picture of what the place looked like everywhere I went, I've noticed that my friends stuck to a certain street or a certain area or a certain aspect of the story. Plus the fact that many of them were saying, oh, sorry, I have to run because we have an online story that we have to finish, and that they stuck to their computers. Indeed, asked me if our website, for example, had updated information all the time. And also something else I've noticed during this uprising is that, especially when it comes to Twitter and Facebook, there was tremendous amounts of misinformation used by all sides of the story, the good side and the bad side and the middle side. So
You've
I'm
got
not
two
sure this is...
two great chunks of things to be dealt with.
Yes.
First of all,
Thank
Laura, lazy journalism, except I would say from what we've just heard, it's not necessarily lazy journalism. It's journalists who are under so much pressure to file all the time now, instantly, that stands in the way of good journalism. But could you and the journalists who just stick in one hotel or one street and don't go out and find things anymore. There's two issues to deal with.
Well, I mean, and from my brief career in journalism, I would say that that's a fairly widespread problem in terms of resource and in terms of management structure. I mean, yes, I'm an online journalist and I have been for my entire career, but that doesn't mean I necessarily think you should be, say, web first at the expense of print or print first at the expense of the web. You need editors and managers who can see the value of the story, which I think is what Kevin was trying to get across, and the appropriate ways of getting that through. Curtailing a great story for the sake of going back and updating a live updating page. I mean, that rails against what good journalism be. So I'm in complete agreement with you, and I don't think we should blame the web for that, but I think we should look at how our kind of editorial structures and management structures are perhaps putting value on certain platforms, either because it's the fashion or because that's where their budgets have been allocated, but at the expense of the story. It seems sort of alien to me.
Almost like cut and paste.
Yeah.
Well, cut and paste is one thing, but Kevin, your immediate experience has been in the BBC. Is there a danger, not that the BBC journalists are being lazy, but that they're run off their feet for one outlet after another in the era of 24-hour television news, and it can get in the way of them actually finding things out?
It's not a danger, it's a reality. It's a reality. And what is interesting, we see John Simpson most nights in Tripoli saying, I can't answer your questions because I'm not able to get outside the hotel. I'm not allowed by the authorities. Actually,
and
you never hear him say, I can't answer your question because, frankly, I was on News 24 until 5 minutes ago, and then I was on the 10, and so I haven't been able to do any journalistic work. You never hear him say that.
And then we get the interview down the line to London from the site where they've been sent out to.
It is a reality. I mean, there are ways of... what is interesting is if you're an absolute Stakhanovite like Robert Peston is, you can use blogging and the web to, and I think, Charles, you've written about this in the book to some extent, to create a new kind of journalism, which is not about the formal deadlines. It's not about the deadline that happens at a... We journalists, we think we understand time. Actually, we only understand the time we've created that fits deadlines. But what Robert has managed to do is create a whole style of journalism where he can tell a story on his blog when he hasn't got the full story. And he says he hasn't got the full story. He says, I've just been speaking to this bloke who tells me X, and Y is also true, and Z is true as well. And it doesn't have that kind of shape necessarily that a complete package for the 10 o'clock on BBC One would have. But it's still journalism. And so there are ways of using the web to create new and more insightful forms of journalism where it's added onto the workload of people who are already filing on the hour, every hour for television, on the hour, every hour for radio, writing a FOOC, that's from our own correspondent, BBC, Speak.
I thought of that. I'm glad you explained
that. Doing a track for the 6 and a track for the 1800, and probably also filing for the World Service. I don't think it's lazy. I think lazy is the one thing it's not, but unable to fulfil the basic tenet of eyewitness journalism, it certainly is.
Thank you. I'm Caroline Byrne. I'm a freelancer, and I'm wondering if the panel could individually say where they see the future going in their areas. I'm wondering do you see a video Twitter, or what do you see in your future? Is there a paywall in your future, or is that sustainable? And for the
Guardian paywall, that'd be something, wouldn't it?
for the BBC gentleman, I'm going to say something blasphemous possibly in your opinion. I do quite well without the BBC. I don't want to pay a license fee. I don't think it's worth it to pay 150 people more than the Prime Minister. And if your journalists are running around, that's perhaps a BBC issue. And I'm wondering, do you see the TV licenses sustainable?
Let's take them in order. Judith first.
All right, I've got my mic, so I think I'm all right. Yeah, I mean, I'm in the lucky position now that I don't need to worry about economic models of journalism so much, because I'm sort of doing academic work as my sort of primary thing at the moment. But in sort of the future...
Everybody can't do PhDs
No, I
to
know.
escape
That's
an
what I'm
economic
saying, but
reality.
I was saying individually, she asked me to answer, but so I'm just interested to see kind of what, because I think we've got to separate out between using these tools for producing journalism. You know, when you're talking about the process of having a blog, and so you're kind of using it as both a research tool, but also as a kind of, this is a thing you're producing, and that's such a sort of interesting area. So I'll just be looking out for new tools to incorporate into that. And I don't know exactly in terms of what do you mean in terms of what the future
Well, you
holds.
were looking at the last part of your chapter at Quora. I'm just has it advanced past when you've written that even? So you see a different future.
I just think the most important thing will be for journalists to be alert as to the places that people are talking, and to try and use that as an accurate sort of reporting tool. So when people are talking about uprisings and things on Twitter, to be careful that they're not just repeating. What I saw a lot of was just a lot of people out of the countries retweeting things, but that wasn't necessarily sort of information on the ground. And so everyone you have to be very wary of using these tools in ill-representative ways, and looking for wherever the kind of the real conversations are happening.
Laura, you and your video social networking?
I think we've seen that with Quick and Bambuza and horrible shaky web videos that no one replied to. I think my future, in terms of The Guardian and its economic realities, here's where I am. Here are the people that make the decisions. That's not to say that I'm not interested in it, but speaking more generally, I think where my future, my team's future is, The Guardian are investing in community management, which isn't organising events for within the newsroom. It's actually dealing with readers and finding better ways to bring them into the process. And I think that's only going to continue and grow across all areas of the site, not just news, because I've got counterparts in culture, development, comment, all around. But speaking more generally in terms of funding, I think and I hope that we'll see a lot more experimenting. The Times is a fascinating experiment, let's call it that. I hope we'll learn from
you don't have to be that polite. Do you think the Times has got paywalls right, or is the Guardian model that the internet is basically most of it free the correct way forward in your view?
I mean, unfortunately, even the most recent Times figures were still fairly opaque. But
No. Delete the word fairly. They were still opaque. A master of the public relations arts, in my view.
But the bit that I'm most interested in is your position within the wider web, and how you can have a general news site like The Times paywalled off from the conversations within the wider web. I don't know, and I wouldn't want to be cut off from that. I personally would find that frustrating as a journalist, to not be able to even just participate in that kind of link sharing or link economy, to be cut off. And I know it means they have more intelligent information about the people that are coming to their website. But again, you've got a gated community, which works for certain more niche titles such as the FT. But I'd hate to be walled, hate to be paywalled.
Immured. This is not a debate about the future of the BBC or its licence fee, but shall we indulge our North American journalists by 2 sentences on why you think the BBC is worth charging 100?
Sorry, I disagree. It is a debate about the licence fee, and is it sustainable in the future? And I may be a North American, but I've lived here for 15 years. I'm well acquainted with the BBC, and I know that the site often turns around Press Association and puts your big J stamp.
Not worth it, says this lady.
Well, it shouldn't. It's very straightforward, really. You've got 3 funding models, broadcasting funding models in this country. And if you remove one bit of the triangle, the whole damn thing will fall apart. I mean, you've got the advertising-only model, which is ITV, which is now doing relatively well. You've got the BBC, which is a one-off payment for most people who watch live TV, about 150 quid, whatever it is.
145.
Yeah. Or you've got the subscription, which is about £600 for the full package a year. Good value. And advertising on top of it, which is the Sky model. And those three things kind of exist in permanent tension. Take any one of them away, and you would either have Murdoch taking over the rest of that triangle, or you would have the collapse of value standards. Or, you know, you might not have started from here, but the British model is the one that actually most North Americans look at rather enviously. And when people write in North America about how we need philanthropy, how we need non-profit institutions to fund journalism, and they scratch around and they try to find things like ProPublica, which are funded largely by philanthropy, or the Huffington Post, which is the greatest thing, you know, in communication since way back when, again, not funded by the market pure, you start to think, well, hang on a minute. Maybe we got something right back in 1922 when someone decided that broadcasting and that values in journalism were so precious we would have to fund it from the public purse, not the government purse, not the state purse, the public purse. I really think, you know, I think this government would be insane if it ever considered tampering with the licence fee. And frankly, I think having given Murdoch the green light for his land grab, I don't think the government will.
Yeah. So, I'll come to you in a moment, but you've had your hand up for a long time, sir. Is there a microphone?
Sorry, well,
I'm sorry, yeah, go there, and then these two.
My name's Richard Tebeth. I'm just a humble reader who blogs occasionally, posts on Facebook most days, and I'm still trying to understand Twitter. You've talked about journalists. You haven't mentioned the editors who constrain and mould, presumably, and limit what the journalists output and alter the shape of the J stamp. And I don't know whether it was here I heard it, but I believe that I've heard it somewhere that editors reflect the views of their readership, or try to pander to the views of their readership to maintain their circulation. So you might like to comment on that. I'm also interested in your view on the state of journalism in America, where Mr. Murdoch seems to does have a stranglehold.
Kevin,
You're the only person here who can aspire, or at least to have a.
Well, I mean, I think
I've been an editor, so it's all down to you.
I think your separation of editors and journalists is an interesting one. I think most editors would say they're journalists. In fact, Tim's sitting behind you, and he's been a newspaper editor as well, and I think he would agree that editors are not non-journalists. Now, there are some editors in some organisations where, if it's a choice between, let us say, telling the truth. Let's think back to those newspapers owned by Mr. Desmond, for instance. And let's think back to the McCann story in 2007, and where the newspapers there had the choice between reporting what they could substantiate, which was nothing, and reporting lies, rumour, innuendo, salacious detail that turned out not to be true. Which did the editor choose? Well, 106 times, apparently, chose the salacious detail, the rumour, and the unsubstantiated truth. So, yeah, there are people within the world of journalism, and this is what I mean about us shooting ourselves in the foot many years ago, who will take the corporate route out. What sells the paper? If it's tripe, who cares? Flog the paper. But that certainly ain't true. I can assure you, in the BBC, you try to understand your audience, but you certainly don't pander to it, and you certainly don't, you know, condition what is truth according to whether you sell your programmes. But it's still a journalistic decision. You know, it might have a kind of strong corporate element to it, but it's still fundamentally a journalistic decision. I don't know enough about North America, I'm afraid, to sorry, but to comment on Murdoch's.
I'm not American.
Take over there.
I thought that's why I deliberately chose North American to hedge my bets. Canadian, right? You're Irish. So am I. So I got that one badly wrong. Mr.
Yes, I'm interested in the definition of journalism. Is it useful to look to the history of journalism? I'm thinking of, say, the late 18th and early 19th century, when the media that was read by the masses was obviously citizen journalism. It was trade union press, it was royal, it was blasphemous, and it was clearly not the Times and the Observer of the day. We know that the precise journalism that Kevin is talking about is very much a historically determined phenomenon, really. It's emerged in the latter part of the 19th century with the emergence of the mass-selling, advertising-based media, which in various ways eliminated or marginalised the citizen journalism. And what we're seeing now, for all kinds of interesting reasons, is the emergence of that kind of citizen journalism, which is actually based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's the right of everyone to communicate. Is it useful to consider it within that context? It's a very kind of historically determined phenomenon, professional journalism.
You want me to go on that one?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I don't agree,
You're
actually.
older than these two.
Yeah.
I don't agree. I wasn't around the 17th century. I don't agree, actually. I mean, the period you're talking about, there were two very distinct strands of journalism, verification and advocacy. Advocacy certainly conforms to your description as citizen journalism, though, of course, you know, the Observer was 1784, I think. The Observer was founded? Sometime around about then. I don't think it's as historically determined as you argue. I think it's more a utilitarian concept, in the sense that what was useful became established as the forms of journalism that, and this is crucial, were able to make money. Because as the 19th century wore on, prints got costlier and costlier. Distribution became costlier and costlier, because of course people were trying to hit specific deadlines, getting the paper out overnight. So the whole thing became costlier, and eventually, as you will know, the cost became so great that it was only by the invention of yellow journalism, and frankly making stuff up as you went along, wonder where we've heard that before, you know, that kind of tradition kicked in. So I'm not sure that you're right when you implicitly, and I know you weren't saying this, Richard, but you sort of were, that there is some kind of early stream here called citizen journalism, which is a bit like what we're starting to see emerge now, and in the way is this great dam which was called professional journalism. I don't think that's quite right. I mean, I think the streams worked in a slightly different way.
Thank you. Someone's been waiting for a long time to have a go.
Chris Smith. I'm going to make a couple of points and also and ask a question. I'm struck by one of the shared comments that seem to come out is that journalists are no longer deeply embedded in their communities. Certainly in my local paper when I started off, I can safely say now the guys that are there are not part of the communities, don't know them, don't be a part of that. I'm also interested in this idea of separating the technology from the work, whether you're writing a blog, whether you're doing a video clip or whatever it is. That's technology. The actual work is separate the tools from the actual sort of craft. But more specifically, I wanted to see if you guys wanted to discuss the ideas around. You've mentioned about trust, but there's an element here around, and also reputation. Isn't that also something to do with brand? There's a business element to this and a kind of a PR element to this. If you're going to deal with issues of trust and reputation, your brand has got to be a part of that. And that then spins on, I mean, this is my that's the question, but if you're going to look at reputation, you've got to get buy-in from your viewers, readers, and whatever else before they actually buy. And if you're going to look at things like issues like paying for content, isn't things like the brand and that element of buy-in, hasn't that got to be a part of the discussion?
Judith, do you have to establish a brand, and a brand that's trusted before anybody pays any attention to you?
I know it's quite an uncomfortable concept for a lot of journalists, and I suppose a byline in a sense always was a brand in terms of at the point of trust that you said. In terms of using that brand more commercially, it's interesting because at originally at the Face the Future conference, Mark Reeve touched on that sort of journalists understanding the commercial aspect of what they do a bit better, which again is like a horrible thought for a lot of journalists that don't want to think about that maybe. And sort of making that content pay. But I just was sort of one interesting freelance research project I did was putting together a kind of database of mobile payment options and paywall structures at various publications. And what the most fascinating thing for me was that the newspapers really badly marketed it, and they kind of assumed that everyone knew what their brand was. But I went on it, and I was doing this as a consumer, deciding, right, okay, am I going to put my credit card details and purchase a subscription? And I really couldn't. I had to send emails and phone up and find out what I was going to get for my money. And I just thought it was astonishing, because if you are going to construct a paywall, you know, you should at least tell people what's behind the other, or what's on the other side.
Just before asking Laura the same question, I'll draw your attention to yet another excellent chapter in the book. I don't know about you, but everywhere I go, I meet young people who say, how do I become a journalist? And I desperately try not to say, don't be so bloody stupid, go and find something more sensible to do with your life. My polite version is, if you're really, really, really determined to be a journalist, then you will become one, despite the obstacles. And here is branding, chapter 14, personal branding, now a key to getting that first foot on the ladder into journalism. Do you think you have to almost brand yourself in order to get a job, which seems a terrible thing to have to do?
You don't have to. But there is the opportunity. I think the difference is there is now that kind of opportunity to, and I think Josh wrote that chapter. He's just left, unfortunately, but
Josh Halliday, yes.
In his terms, that was setting himself apart from other members of his student body by setting up a website, setting up a hyperlocal or local news service, and just kind of having that portfolio and that CV already online. But I think, interesting, leading on from that, this idea of how important the brand is to your readers' trust and loyalty is complicated now by the fact that we do have individual, horrible words, journalist brands within that. And that's very difficult. That's very difficult for newsrooms to manage. But actually, there's a golden opportunity there for rebuilding that trust by saying, hey, look, Ian Cobain, Paul Lewis, fantastic investigative journalists, and they're also on Twitter, and you can follow them here. Why don't you go and see their J-stamped journalism interface, and making more of that? And that's not selling them. That's just realising that your brand is now quite fractious, frankly, and that actually individuals have their own, you know, they're bringing their own thing to the party. So how newsrooms sort of make the most of that, and I guess you have to you're therefore relinquishing a bit of control over your brand, aren't you, as well, because you've got individuals going off linked to your news organisation but under their own auspices on social media. So there is you have to relinquish a little bit of control. I think we're always in danger of kind of doing ourselves down in this debate as well, and not flagging up the people who actually handle themselves very well or conduct themselves very well as journalists, and we should be making the most of them if we're going to try and rebuild this trust in our brands.
Okay, the microphone is here.
Heidi's been very patient over there. She's got a microphone.
Oh, all right. Well, both of you. Then there are two microphones. Heidi.
I'm actually just going to. I work for a PR consultancy, so some would call me the enemy. But actually, I want to thank the chair and the panelists for what's a fascinating debate. I work with and deal with some highly respected journalists, and I do believe there is still a role. I want to touch on the points that the two gentlemen have made. One is citizen journalism. I think that everyone can now be a journalist, you know, with the emergence of digital media and social media, where you can, you know, you can broadcast yourself on YouTube or Facebook or whatever it is. I think the other really interesting thing is the reputation aspect to it. Considering today that it's been reported by, you know, all of the broadcasters that 2 journalists have been arrested, and they're classed as investigative journalists, how do journalists go about rebuilding their reputation? And you know, what would they like their reputation to be?
Well, I always believe in giving credit where it's due. The 2 journalists, News of the World journalists arrested, according to the Evening Standard, are Ian Edmondson, former assistant editor, and chief reporter Neville Thurlback. But joking apart, Kevin, how serious is what I believe is still a relatively untold story about the scale of illegal phone tapping? How serious is that for the sort of journalism that you would like to aspire to?
It's not at all serious for the journalism that I want to aspire to. It is absolutely devastating for the kind of journalism that we have, especially in the Murdoch press. It'd be interesting to see, incidentally, how this is reported tomorrow in the Murdoch press. Because if you remember, when the Select Committee reported last year on the phone hacking scandal, it was almost as if it hadn't happened. It was nowhere in the News of the World, nowhere in the Sun, one paragraph in the Times, nothing in the Sunday Times. Interesting too that it took the New York Times to do a thorough investigation into this. This is devastating, frankly, for this type of journalism. Fortunately, it is very clearly and unequivocally illegal, and therefore the best way that any journalist on that paper can rebuild their reputation is not break the law anymore. It's quite straightforward. The really worrying thing, though, back in 2006, Richard Thomas, who was then the data commissioner, he named, well, sorry, he didn't name them, but he found 305 journalists from different newspapers, including, the good ones. I'm afraid the Observer and the Guardian were among them, in the records of one private detective who was, I think, in Hastings, the South Coast, anyway. And that gave a sense of the scale of not just phone tapping, because in 2006 it wasn't illegal, but also going through bins, paying receptionists.
Benji the bin man.
Benji the bin man. If you remember, I just find it incredible in this country that one of the chief executives in one of the biggest newspaper groups in the land has admitted to a committee of MPs that she and her newspaper bribed policemen. How the hell is that allowed?
And nothing has happened,
Yes,
to my knowledge.
Now, how on earth, we're talking about brands, but how on earth can any of us trust an organisation that thinks, here's someone who bribes a policeman, let's make her a chief executive of our organisation? What does that do for the brand?
Honest.
Martin Lewis, can I just pull us back to our debate at the moment? It seems to me that journalism is in a kind of limbo land at the moment between the destruction of the empire and the new elements still attempting to be formed. And we're heading for a world where, if you look at the average audience for the main evening news programmes, 6 o'clock, 6:30, and the 2 at 10 o'clock, it is 2.5 million viewers. Now, assuming there's no overlap in that at all, that is 10 million people watching the main television news programmes and maybe a handful on Sky or 24-hour news. That means that there is 3/4, at least, of the adult population of this country that is not watching any television news, that is getting its news from other sources. So I think we're heading for a world, and I'd love your reaction on this, because I'd like to ask the panel what the world is going to be like in 20 years' time. Is it going to be unrecognisable in terms of the newspapers and the television that we have? I think we're heading for a world where everyone is going to be their own news editor, and they are going to choose from a multiplicity of sources the news, and only the news, that they want to watch. The big danger of that is that people will not get the news that is actually really important. They wouldn't, for example, week 2 of what is happening in, Rwanda or Chechnya or whatever it may be, or Ivory Coast. They would not be interested in that. And if people are going into the whirlpool of their own interest because of the way the technology is providing television news, then I really do believe that politicians will follow suit. They will start pandering to the lowest common denominator, so you're going to get a less informed society being pandered to by politicians, and the kind of politicians we will get and the kind of society we'll get will be totally transformed by what is happening. And I don't know how you can put the genie back in the bottle and get responsible journalism in there as a serious part of the ordinary, everyday mix for ordinary folk.
Judith, is that the world you recognise for 20 years hence, when you're bringing up your children in a difficult world?
I probably wouldn't be so gloomy or worried about it. I mean, obviously consumption is changing hugely, even between, say, me and then my younger brother, in the way that we consume news. Like, there's just radical differences, and obviously it's shaking up, and more every day. I think I find myself like I am tailoring what I consume more, and being less broad in what I take in. But I think there's still a hunger, and and people will still feel the need to produce responsible journalism, and it will find a way into the world somehow.
People will feel the need to produce responsible journalism. But what if Martin is right? They have no bloody interest in consuming it and sort of actually filter out the unpleasant from their lives.
Yeah, I mean,
but you could argue that. Sorry,
no, go.
You could argue that is already happening, and I'm slightly plain devil's advocate here, but perhaps I pick up a Sunday paper and I immediately chuck out the travel section, the news section. I just want to read the sport. I'm not saying that's what I do, but particularly your point on how people are picking and choosing from different sources, I'd argue that that's already happening and is becoming increasingly widespread. I think what journalism and news organisations need to get better at is understanding that the news you ought to know can still be disseminated. We just have to, as Judith was saying, realise that people are communicating in different ways. So, for example, I may personalise my news, but I trust people that I am connected to on LinkedIn, or I trust people I'm connected to on Facebook. If they share news that perhaps didn't fit in my sphere of interest, I'm likely to read it because it's come from a certain source. So we need to get better at finding ways to kind of infiltrate those ways if we're worried about it going down the personalised route, because I think that's already happening. I think that's kind of a given, frankly.
Kevin, when you and I are on our Zimmer frames in Cheltenham or something, will we be railing?
We're both going to be in Cheltenham, is that?
If we run into each other, will we be railing about this terrible world where nobody takes anything seriously anymore? And Neil Postgate's many prediction of about 30 years ago, we were all in danger of amusing ourselves to death.
No. I kind of agree with what's behind your question, but I'm not as pessimistic, Martin, actually. You're right that on a normal day, 2 million or so will watch the big 10 o'clock bulletins and so on. Actually, on a big day, it can double easily. And I think that it still indicates there is the appetite, knowing that there is something going on, let's go to the built bulletins. But don't write off 24-hour news, because those audiences are building all the time. Also, I mean, it's true that the web allows us to personalise our news much better than we used to be able to do it. But peek to the back here, and I don't know what the figures are for the BBC website homepage, but they're pretty high as a proportion of the entire traffic to the BBC News website. Yeah.
He also left the BBC last week.
When the Japanese earthquake was going on, we had 15 million people that day look at the news website, and that would have been a very large proportion of the overall BBC traffic. 40% of those looked at video that day, so you're looking at millions of people consuming news through the website.
Yeah, and they're coming at it not just to the stories that they want, which is, of course, what other bits of the web offer you. You do have that, great front page, which is sort of saying, here's Japan, but here's also Ivory Coast, here's also something else. So the serendipity element is still there.
You can't use the really big stories that happen maybe 6 or 7 times a year to illustrate the general.
No, but what you can illustrate is that I think there still will be. I think we've reached the bottom of the kind of potting out generation, actually. I think we've niched as far as we're going to go. And I think we're starting to see some collection again probably around different mediums, but certainly a collection.
Okay, one more question, and then we'll have these 2 guys in the back. 3 more. Oh my God! Well, look, come on. This is luckily the plug's not going to be full. Very quick question.
Okay, I'm Janice Winter. I work with John Lloyd, researching journalism and democracy. Kevin, my question is directed mainly at you in terms of your initial opener that there's a lot that we think is journalism but isn't. I'm quite interested to know whether you see the division as a pro-am division, as a print-digital division, as an institutional stamp or individual division, just because my experience, I agree that there are concerns with the changes that are happening in terms of, for me, it's mainly fragmentation, it's business models, but in terms of my experience of how I consume news, I consume news in different ways for different information, and so while the Daily Mail may have more readers than someone like Ben Goldacre, there are figures like Nate Silver, like Iglesias, like Klein, who have now got the institutional stamp because they've been seen as really influential figures online who've commanded authority and large audiences. A friend of ours from Africa, his newspaper, which is the biggest in his country, had 50,000, but his anonymous blog had 17,000 hits a day. There are these kinds of examples. Also, I can look at sort of John Simpson, or I can look at local, very well-established journalists on Twitter in those countries who have enormous context. So my question is just...
remember the police station
Sorry, my question is just this para-journalism, or what we think is journalism, but is it? what kind of where's the division that you see? I'm confused. Is it a digital print? Is it a pro-am?
No.
Is it an institutional or individual based?
I think it's largely unclear, but I think there is something institutional about it. And while not, this is a very quick shortcut to try to answer your question. I think I'm trying not to say, if you call yourself journalism, you are journalism, but it's kind of moving in that direction. And there is a difference between, here's a narrative that is based on what I found out, it is truthful, it is eyewitness, it is considered. There's a difference between that and the information that most of us pass around on a daily basis. That's the kind of thing that I have in mind. But I'm trying to sort of answer your question very quickly.
Good, thanks. And particularly some questions for our younger generation journalists, online bloggers, etc. So it'd be good if you had something for them.
My question really is more about, are we really seeing journalism as it's journalism if it's consumed in print and specifically online? And really, might there be the case that there isn't a drop in demand in news consumption because really people are consuming news. It's just that they're not consuming it on, say, the Guardian's website or possibly the BBC or obviously, News International sites. They are consuming it on their own social networking platforms. And I think as was mentioned before, Twitter does reach opinion formers, and those opinion formers then take that debate outside of the online debate. So might it be the case that in fact we are seeing that news is being shaped, but it's just not being shaped in the platforms that news traditionally has been very comfortable with, your print, your TV, your online.
Got it. Is there just as much consumption, just as much shaping of the news, and Martin Lewis is just concerned because the viewing figures to the big built programs have gone down, but actually things have just changed a bit.
Yeah, it could be in different places and via social networks, maybe rather than non-social networks, but because it's linking to source quite often, so it's stores, but from lots of different places. And what I thought, I didn't say at the time in reply to Martin's question, was there was tremendous engagement actually with all of the uprisings in the Middle East and sort of people interested in those stories. People are interested, and I think that's very heartening, and we should give us to something to grab onto, I think.
Laura, briefly.
I completely agree, and also I don't think we're terribly worried about our profession and our career, and sometimes we don't give our readers enough credit for the fact that they may be interested in news just because they're interested in news, and they may actually use other sites to sate their need for salacious gossip, and then they may return to news sources that they trust. That's a possibility too. We tend to see the other side of it because we're so worried about our profession.
Last question from the corner.
Thank you.
Oh God, there's two last questions then.
Okay, thank you.
Two.
Mark Wadsworth, editor of thelatest.com.
John, they're not going to turn the electric on.
One of the contributors.
Sorry.
Yeah, we're talking insurrection here. We need an Egypt in this country, and it's happening through the people. Richard Keeble's question about citizen journalism wasn't really answered. I've gone from being a journalist of 30 years, BBC, Langham House with Dunhill and all the rest of it, speech coaching, to being a part of the insurrection, citizen journalism, and you can break the shackles. Come out of your cosy ivory towers and come and join us. UK Uncut, that campaign that believes in direct action. They wouldn't go to The Guardian to get publicised, to organise in Oxford Street, or Regent Street, or wherever, or to go to Fortnum and Mason's. They have their own means of disseminating news. That's what the young people are doing with their Blackberries, not just on Facebook. My partner here is on her phone texting at the moment because she's so bored with what's being talked about, sadly. Probably by me too. So the question is about citizen journalism to Laura and Judith. I'm at City University as well in the journalism department. Welcome. I'm fighting them on a race discrimination case. It's a very institutionally racist place, but there'll be more about that later. Final plug is about a Italian woman military officer who told me last night on the web that she was in captivity in Libya for 60 days, captured by the rebels. There are about 200-odd Italian troops in there from the West. I'm going to print that story soon. Did you know that? Well, you'll read about it on the latest.
Good, sir. It may or may not be true. Last question over there.
Yes, Neil Fowler.
Hello, Neil Fowler. Sorry to bring back to Filthy Lucre, but where's the money going to come from, I'm afraid? The Guardian is a busted financial case. The BBC, you've heard Martin Lewis say there, the news viewers on the BBC are outnumbered wholeheartedly by those who don't watch the news on the BBC. I think the licence fees safe. But for 150 years, we have subsidised news by advertising. The advertising model hasn't just changed slightly, it's just changed completely and will not come back in the same way. So where is the money going from? Are young people going to pay for news? Because if news isn't paid for in some way, it's going to go away because we won't be doing it all for nothing.
I have absolutely no idea. I mean, because people aren't prepared to pay for it in the same way they were. I mean, I look around my peers, people are not paying for news. And I mean, like I said, I've attended a lot of journalism conferences. This question came up at every single one, and I didn't hear any very compelling answers.
I have to agree, and that's not to say it doesn't concern me. We don't know. What we need to be doing is not looking for silver bullets and experimenting. We also have to get our editorial departments and our commercial departments talking to each other, and that's not, I'm not saying you have to sully one with the other. I'm just saying actually having conversations about this issue, this problem, because we've been able to pin the blame on each other for so long, and actually now we're at a point where we need to come up with some solutions because the ones we've got aren't tenable.
It was going to be my last question to you. It's been done for me by Mr. Fowler. Is there a serious problem with financing your model of the strange, specific thing called journalism going forward?
The BBC is a £3 billion business. Sky is a £5 billion business. I don't know how much ITV generates.
1.6 annual advertising revenue.
If you cannot pay for decent journalism out of 9.6 billion quid, and we think money's the problem, and incidentally, just on the advertising point.
It's in print.
Yeah, the problem with print was that the newspapers took 5 years too long to realise that display advertising did not work on the web. Google found out, Yahoo found out, in fact every bugger else found out apart from the newspapers, and suddenly realised that the adverts that worked on the web were the ones that matched seller with buyer. That's what Google discovered. If a news organisation that is relying on advertising can somehow reinsert themselves into that model, and it's too late now because, Google, Yahoo, they're there already, then of course you can find the money for funding journalism. I don't think paywalls are the answer. Pads might be the answer. I think one of the things that Murdoch is probably right about is that the tablets are a bit of a game changer because they have that kind of consumer experience that might make people feel this is quite a nice thing to have. Accepting advertising through that medium. But I honestly don't think there is any shortage of money around. It's just that particularly on the print side of things, the business model was hung on to for far longer than it could sustain. But with nearly 10 billion quid in the broadcasting market, I mean, honestly, if you can't pay for decent journalism out of that, then you want your head examined.
On that wondrously optimistic and cheerful note, I hand over to Richard Keeble.
Right, the very last word. I've been very lucky in my professional life. I was an editor of a trade union journal, and then for the last 27 years, I've been a hackademic. I've been privileged to work in higher education, journalism. And central to my teaching has been this very simple principle. I've tried to bring journalists and academics together to discuss things. Now, academics and journalists see things often very differently, but out of that dialogue usually comes amazingly fascinating material. You see it in this book, which has just been published. There's some terrific essays in there. Journalists have spent the time to actually write and reflect on their work. Academics have put in their input, and this is something that John Mayer and I are really committed to. We organise in Coventry and me in Lincoln debates involving journalists and the public. Yesterday I had Bridget Kendall, BBC diplomatic correspondent, and Angus Stickler from City University discussing WikiLeaks, and the room was packed with journalism students and the public. And it's this debate, extending the debate we've had in this room, fascinating, to the public through the publication of books that this book is about. So thanks very much for coming and enjoying such a fantastic discussion.
The bar is open, by the way, and the books are for sale at 15 quid each. In the back, please buy some. The bar is open, please do.